I appreciate your time today, especially during lunch, and hopefully the information that we provide you will be useful for your own company and yourself. So I want to start by just simply walking through the agenda. The first things we wanted to do were talk about some very clear and simple definitions about sustainability, ESG, corporate social responsibility, and what all of that actually means. The second thing we want to do is talk about the social and market forces driving these initiatives and the impacts that it could pose for your business. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with talking about some of the various disclosure frameworks out there and how it might impact your own internal controls and management systems as you begin your own ESG and sustainability journey within your company. So with that being said, the first thing I want to do is just talk about some of those definitions. We take a very simple approach to this. And so when you hear the term sustainability, we always look at it as, sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generation to meet their needs. I think we all agree on that simple principle. But in the corporate world, it's also about activities that enhance our ability of your company to create value over the long term. And we're going to talk about some of the areas where this value is created from. And so we're going to talk about issues such as climate change, social justice, and standards of running a good company. In other words, the governance side of ESG. So why is this important? So it's estimated that by 2025, nearly a third of all global assets under management will be allocated to sustainable investments with clear ESG goals, which equates to about $50 trillion worldwide, which is really astonishing when you think about the numbers. And so what's happening in the world economy is we're beginning to transition the entire world's economy from fossil fuels to other means. If you look at the products, the goods and services that you consume on a daily basis, there's nearly nothing that you touch or utilize that does not have fossil fuels in its supply chain in some way, shape, or form, whether it be natural gas, whether it be petroleum derivatives, or different types of fuel like diesel and airline fuel and those types of stuff. So it's going to be really important that we begin understanding what it means at the macro level for the economy. And we added just a quick blurb from Larry Fink, who, by the way, is the chairman of BlackRock Asset Management. They are one of the world's largest investors. And so when you think of putting capital to work, it's folks like BlackRock that kind of drive a lot of the ways in which we allocate capital and invest money. So, and one of the statements he made recently is that the next 1,000 unicorns or those unusual companies won't be search engines or social media companies. They're going to be sustainable, scalable innovators and startups that help the world decarbonize and make the energy transition affordable for all. And I believe that as well. So what is ESG? ESG is broken into three components: the E for environmental, S for social, and G for governance. So ESG is used to evaluate companies' overall corporate responsibility and to make sure that we're conserving our environment. We have consideration for the people in and around us and the communities that we serve and the standards of running a business. So, and we're going to go through each one of these into greater detail. But environmental this is your company's impact on energy consumption. Your use of emissions, especially greenhouse gases and waste. Now you will begin, if you haven't already, you are going to start hearing a lot about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. This is how your carbon footprint for your company is measured. And we're going to go into greater detail on what scope 1, 2, and 3 means. But the other areas that are involved in kind of these environmental reports and disclosures have to do with your energy consumptions, not only what you emit, but what you consume. So we're also talking about your buildings, your facilities, perhaps your fleets of vehicles. And then environmental, of course, we talk about climate change, as well as the environmental regulations and practices that center around this. So just to give you a little bit of history about how all of this is starting to take shape. So under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which many of you have probably heard about in the news, there was basically an agreement signed by 200 countries that agreed to limit global warming by no more than 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. In other words, we don't want the temperature, the average global temperature, to rise above 2 degrees. And especially with the aim for no more than 1.5 degrees. The 2 degrees scenario is widely seen as the global community's accepted limitations of temperature growth to kind of avoid catastrophic impacts on our globe. And so, as you might recall, and I don't want to get into any kind of political discussion, but when Trump was in office, he removed the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. And then when Biden was reelected, one of the first things he did was sign an executive order rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. So getting back to those greenhouse gas emissions that we spoke of. They're categorized into 3 groups or scopes. So scope 1, this is your fuel combustion, company vehicles, and any fugitive emissions from your operations. The scope 2 emissions are any purchased electricity, heat, and steam. You can think about your furnaces, boilers, any of those types of things that you have in your operations. And then scope 3 goes into much more detail. These are purchased goods and services. This is your business travel. It's how your employees commute. It's things like your recycling programs that you would have in the office. Do you separate recyclables? And it's about how you dispose of your waste. This is how these particular types of scopes are categorized. Scope 1 are typically more intensive in nature, scope 2 being less, and then finally scope 3 are all those other things that we do on a daily basis that produce emissions. So if they aren't now, in the next couple of years, I think you'll start seeing that terms like scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions will start becoming kind of normal language that we use as part of describing our businesses. So if you were to look at your scope 1, your scope 2, and your scope 3 emissions, these all come together to create your company's carbon footprint, or this is the total amount of greenhouse gases that are generated by our everyday actions. And if you watch the news lately, or if you read any trade publications, you're going to see a lot of various companies making declarations about when they plan to get to net zero, which basically refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases produced versus the amount we remove from the atmosphere. And so, very simply, net zero is achieved when the amount we add is no more than the amount taken away. And so ideally, to get to that under 2 degrees Celsius mandate that has really been set by the UN, many companies are setting their own targets for when they will be considered net zero. Now, ESG is not just about the environment. It is also about how we as companies socially interact with one another. And of course, social is just our companies focused on our employment regulations, health and safety of our employees, how we train and educate our folks, and your contributions to the communities and stakeholders that you serve. And so many of these areas include, community engagement. Maybe your company is involved with a worthy cause or a charitable organization that they embrace. This is also about diversity, ethnicity, and inclusion. How have you set hiring policies to attract and retain a diverse mix of employees from varying backgrounds, whether it be race, various cultures or countries? And so ESG mandates are starting to, I guess the right word is they are starting to require that many companies begin to create diversity, ethnicity, and inclusion policies within their own programs. And so here we're also talking about human rights, safety and security, social justice issues, and really talent attraction and retention. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the way we hire, the way we attract, and the way we keep people has really changed. It's been called the Great Resignation for a reason. And so what employees are asking for has really changed from their employers. And it's important that we as employers keep up with the times to make sure that we can always have the best people with the top skills to make sure that all of our customers are satisfied. And then finally, the G section, governance. These are the policies, management systems, your internal controls, how you manage risk, and compliance with laws and regulations. In other words, how do you govern the business that you're in? Have you established corporate philosophies like your values, your mission, your company's vision? How do you articulate your company's strategy, both to internal stakeholders as well as to the external community? And basically all those other types of management system frameworks, whether it be a quality management system, whether it be a safety management system, there are all types of varying programs that companies put in place to make sure their operations are kind of firing on all cylinders. And of course, if you are in such an industry that has a lot of regulatory compliance, is how well do you apply with those local, state, federal mandates, as well as any industry specific regulations that you have to comply with. So having a solid practice around environmental, social, and governance is becoming increasingly important in the marketplace. And we're going to talk about what's driving a lot of that. So, why does it matter? Why do I need an ESG program or policy? The simple truth is that, the world is changing and we're experiencing significant demographic shifts in buying behaviors of customers, consumer sentiment around issues like social justice, like the environment, like how companies are governing themselves. And of course, the dramatic effects that climate change is having on all of those businesses. We also have a new generation of investor that's emerging. And, the millennial generation is said that will be putting about 20 trillion into US ESG investments. So they are very much a huge driver of this, and they're driving this with their wallets. So we're seeing one of the largest wealth transfers in the history of the United States with the aging baby boomers transitioning wealth to the millennial generation. And those millennials are investing differently than their parents and grandparents did. We are also seeing much better data, research, reporting, and analytics capabilities. Our systems and computer systems that manage this data are becoming far more robust, far more intuitive, and that data is being used to drive a lot of these types of decisions. And then finally, we're seeing tremendous regulatory shifts. I mentioned the United States re-entering the Paris Climate Accord, but there's a number of other things happening within the government sector that is really shifting the advocacy of ESG disclosures. And we're going to talk about some of those disclosures in greater detail. And then finally, the idea that ESG is voluntary is starting to change as well. For many public companies, and in the next couple of years, all public companies will be mandated to report on ESG metrics. In fact, just yesterday, there was a report out from the from the government about the SEC and their role in monitoring and setting policy for ESG disclosures. So it's coming. So regardless of whether you are a public or private company, it would behoove you to begin looking at this straight away. So I wanted to ask if at this point, if there were any questions before I moved on. I wanted to give everybody a chance to kind of weigh in and ask a question if they have one. And if not, I'll keep going, but just let me know. Don't hesitate to speak up. So another issue is, why does it matter? So ESG is also becoming an increasing driver in business transactions. It is becoming a condition for accessing capital. Banks no longer want risky assets on their balance sheets. So getting financing for, say, a solar farm or a wind farm is certainly going to be much easier than if you want to build a coal mine these days, or drill for oil for that matter. So things like accessing capital are becoming very much dependent on where your company is in these ESG requirements. Many auditing firms, especially the big four that audit public companies, are beginning to include discussions about ESG in their management discussion and analysis section of the audit, as well as their letters. Government regulations and policies are driving a tremendous amount of growth in this area. And I think most importantly, especially for the private sector, is that this is fast becoming a vendor procurement requirement. We're seeing a number of our clients who are part of a larger company's supply chain, or they are a supplier to a much larger company, having their processes audited by their customer. And so they want to make sure that the companies that they are doing business with, whether public or private, have ESG mandates. These are there are companies out there that their sole purpose is to audit these companies for the protection and the risk mitigation strategies of those parent companies and or large companies that have very diverse supply chains. So, and ESG is also seen as a risk mitigation strategy, and it's certainly becoming a board of director level imperative. For large companies, many have already instituted a person on their board who is specifically given the mandate of assessing ESG. In many companies, they are hiring directors of ESG and chief sustainability officers. You're going to see a lot of different titles come across, but they all kind of do the same thing, and that is mitigate risk around ESG within the companies that they serve. And then, of course, social justice issues are driving tremendous change, and a big factor of that is the use of social media. So not only are people making decisions with their pocketbooks about where they want to invest their money, but they're also making their opinions known on social media. So as a company, especially if, for instance, if you were a consumer products company and you sold products out to the general public, your stance on those social issues, it can become a significant factor in whether or not people will choose to do business with you. And so that's something that I think companies really have to begin thinking about as they assess risk within their own organization. So I talked a little earlier about some of the regulatory issues that were happening, some of the changes that were happening around the government. And of course, the key thing here is that we believe that self-regulation, pardon me, will eventually give way to mandated compliance and disclosure requirements. So what used to be voluntary will now become mandated. Not only will it be mandated, you will be measured on it and you will be graded, and it will have a significant impact on your business. I wanted to provide a little insight into some of the more risky areas and how rating agencies like S&P, Bloomberg, Moody's, those types of folks are looking at different industries in regard to their ESG risk. Now, as you can well imagine, oil and gas, metals and mining, any type of those heavy industries that use a lot of fossil fuels, those are coming under increasing scrutiny. And so things like service organizations, like an insurance agency like Synergy Comp, will most likely have a very small carbon footprint and are very low on the risks, just like banks, real estate, those types of things. But it's really, if you're in a heavy industry, if you're in steel fabrication, if you're in metals and mining and any type of power generation, right now you have a bullseye on your back in regard to ESG. So it's kind of important to know where your industry is and where it ranks. That way you know that what those types of expectations will be. And those expectations are not always just environmental in nature, but they can be social in nature as well. For instance, if you look at this particular chart, media, for instance, has a huge social aspect to it. As you can well imagine, are you a responsible media company? And what type of content are you creating? Are you utilizing valid sources for your content? There's huge questions around this, and that will continue to be so as time goes on. I also wanted to provide a little bit of insight into what at least we're seeing the various company size and their need for ESG services and where they're kind of putting their resources right now. So if you're a large market, and we define large market by over 3 billion, they're often highly complex companies. They're often public. They might have multi-divisions, but most of these are now creating dedicated roles, like a dedicated sustainability and ESG staff. Perhaps you have a chief sustainability officer, and you are certainly making public disclosures. This is being driven for them by their investors, financiers, and customers. And these are the folks that are really at the forefront of setting the standards and what is happening out in the economy as it relates to ESG. Now, the middle and the small market are a little different. These folks are often privately held. Sustainability, ESG functions are usually housed in perhaps legal or compliance or even EHS functions. They're often driven by their demands from their own customers. And so they have begun to get exposed to sustainability and ESG issues, but they might have limited knowledge and don't quite know right now how best to navigate this. And then, of course, there's the very small companies who may not be seeing this yet in their industry, but just give it time, you will. And those folks often have little exposure or knowledge of even what sustainability and ESG means at this point. But we like to walk our clients kind of through this to let them know kind of where they stand at this point, especially if they fall into that little exposure, exposed to sustainability, or they're at the forefront of setting standards. So it's important to know where where companies are, and kind of that way they know, what's going to be my heavy lift, or is it a heavy lift to get us where we need to go in regard to those types of disclosures. So I mentioned a little earlier some of the rating agencies, but if you're a large public company, you are being rated on your exposure, your ESG exposure. Companies like Dow Jones, S&P, Thomson Reuters, all of these folks have stood up ESG organizations within their companies, and they are solely responsible for looking at public companies' ESG exposure, ranking that and risk ranking that for the financial markets. So as you can imagine, if they're doing this for the large corporates, the corporates will then begin pushing those mandates down through their supply chains into their own vendor base. So there's a number of varying types of frameworks out there that you can begin reporting your ESG metrics based on. Three of the most popular right now are the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the Global Reporting Initiative Standards, and then SASB, which is the Sustainability and Accounting Standards Board. I would urge you, if you haven't looked at these yet, go out to their websites. You can just Google TCFD, GRI, SASB. They will give you great information. Most of this information is free. Log on, peruse the website, go through some of the standards documentations. And like I said, most of this documentation is provided complimentary on those websites. So, and it's a good thing to begin familiarizing yourself with what are all the components that go into these types of reports. Many companies are changing policy, and they are inserting ESG tailored disclaimers into their regulatory filings. Their directors, board of directors, and their corporate officers now almost have to be completely versed in ESG reporting and those particular frameworks. And most importantly, it's the key decision makers in those companies need to identify those stakeholders impacted by this. So for instance, if you're a mid-sized company, you're not public. However, it's important that if you have an inside counsel or a legal staff on board, it's important that they begin familiarizing themselves with those GRI, SASB frameworks. Certainly, if you have an EHS staff, an environmental health and safety group, it's important that they understand how these things work, because inevitably, you will be asked to provide documentation around your policies as it pertains to ESG. If it's not happening now, and 2 years from now, mark my words, you will be asked these questions. So, I want to take another breather there. Are there any questions that I can answer for anybody? No? Okay. So this is just a simple graph that shows the benefits of having strong environmental, social, and governance practices in place, and how they create value. So I would urge you all to kind of take some time, look through this. This was a study from McKinsey, but things like how does this impact our top line growth? How does this increase productivity? How does this increase our regulatory or any legal interventions? And cost reduction specifically. If you are lowering energy consumption, if you are reducing waste, that all goes right to your bottom line. So if there are areas in which you can reduce waste, if you can reduce cost, especially on key inputs like fuel, they will have dramatic impacts on your cost structure. So where do you start after you heard all this? My goal was not to kind of scare you or anything like that. It's just to basically acknowledge the fact that there's a significant shift happening in the economy. This shift will continue over the next several years. No company is going to be immune from it. And we just want to make sure that you're prepared from a risk perspective on this. So we just put a little 6-point bullet here to kind of say, hey, where do you start? You know, and really it's making sure to align your leadership's expectations around ESG. What does it mean? Share these key concepts and definitions with them. The next step is to what we call conduct a materiality assessment, and that is basically understanding what your potential ESG exposure is in real terms. You know, what is our impact on the environment? What are we doing from a social perspective? And then how are we governed? You know, do we have the right management systems in place, the proper policies and procedures in place? So all of those things would be reviewed as part of that materiality assessment. And so once you identify the gaps, you begin to create programs and policies to close those gaps. And then from there, you can begin creating your own sustainability and ESG strategy. And then for yourself, identifying what reporting framework makes sense. And then finally, we always advocate for creating an annual sustainability report. You know, and I will say this, depending on the size of your organization, if you were a very small organization, this may just be a 1 or 2 page document. However, if you're a larger organization, if you're, you know, $50 million and above, you really have to start thinking about how you are going to articulate your ESG strategy, not only to your customers, but the broader marketplace. And because it becomes such an important aspect of your business. One of the things that we very much advocate for is not only making your annual report a disclosure document, but it should also be a marketing document as well. And that's to make sure that the broader marketplace, the folks that you interact with on a daily basis, understand what commitments you've made, what you're doing in the community, how you're governing yourselves, and what are those actions that you're taking to make the environment and your communities better. And so what we've typically found is that when you do this, it creates great goodwill in the community. Other companies will start modeling their behavior on yours, and it's good for everybody involved. It's good for you as leaders. It's good for your employees. It's good for the communities you serve, and it's certainly good for your customers. So with that, that is the end of this particular presentation. But I would like to open it up to any questions that you have. I'd be happy to answer any inquiries that you have at this time. So, and again, thank you for your time today.
Don, can you share some of the ways that you've helped your specific clients with their ESG reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really all starts with that gap assessment and understanding where a company currently is. For instance, when we go into an organization, we go through the kind of an audit checklist, if you will, and that's to make sure that we understand where they are in relation to their current state versus best practice in ESG reporting. And so in a sense, we take those regulatory filings and then work backwards from that. And that usually gives us a great insight into where companies are. So once we help them with that gap assessment, we can then work with them on policies and procedure development, helping them craft their own messaging around E, S, and G. And then finally, we actually help write and produce the annual reports. And we always advocate that all of our clients provide these reports to their customer base, to the institutions they work with, like their bankers, their insurance agents, their vendors. We are always amazed at the feedback we get from that, especially from the financial community, whether it be your bankers, your insurance agents, and especially your customers. So that's, you know, the really short version of that question, but thank you. Well, if there aren't any more questions, Rose, I'll turn it over to you. And but I just wanted to let everybody on the call know, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to answer them. You know, doing the webinar online, you kind of don't get maybe you're not as apt to ask questions, but if you would like, feel free to email us, call us. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. And by the way, I would just tell everybody on the call, feel free to share this with anybody that you like. There's nothing proprietary on here. We always feel like the more people that understand this, the better they're going to be prepared. Again, my goal was not to scare anybody, but it's important to also know that this is one of the biggest fundamental shifts that is happening in the business world today. You know, outside of the geopolitical issues that we're having, like in Europe, but this is something that's going to fundamentally change the way business gets done over the next decade.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, and as Don mentioned, this is going to be sent out on demand afterwards, so you will have this for review, and obviously be sure to share with your colleagues. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.